The opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Cable 14, its sponsors, or its shareholders, Cogeco Cable, Shaw Cable, and Source Cable Limited.
Welcome to Hamilton Works. I'm your host, Al Lutchin. We're going to be talking about the importance of corporate governance in the first half of the show, and then the importance also of doing job search over the holiday period if you happen to be looking. Our first guest is Sandy Shaw, who is Director of Social Responsibility of the First Ontario Credit Union. Welcome, Sandy.
Hi, Al.
And Sandy, you're a specialist in governance, and it kind of sounds like one of those dry topics, but is a topic that is so important to us as far as shareholders are concerned, as far as employment is concerned, and growth. So tell us why it's so important.
Well, I agree with you that it's important. I also actually think it's quite exciting. Although the definition of what governance is a little dry, and that is the system by which organizations or corporations are directed and controlled. But despite that sort of a boring definition, governance is very vital to us in our communities. It goes on every day in important organizations, as you described, organizations that deliver vital services like hospitals and schools, companies that we invest our money, our pension dollars are governed by board of directors, so that's governance. So it's a very important function. It's often invisible to us, though, despite the fact that it's important, and it's either invisible or not well understood, unless, of course, something goes wrong. And if there's some form of governance failure, a corporate governance failure, people, stand up and pay attention to governance. They want to know who was in charge, who made these decisions, basically where does the buck stop. And in fact, the buck stops at boards of directors that can control these organizations and corporations. And
corporate governors also can directly impact corporate culture and employee engagement, can it?
Absolutely. The sort of the standard for what boards do is that they set the tone at the top. So boards make conscious decisions about what kind of organization that they want to be in control of, and they determine the values, the ethics of an organization. They set the strategic direction as well. So at that level, they're making decisions about what the expectation is for the kind of organization that they're going to be in charge of. And so that just naturally flows down through an organization. So if a board is serious about the kind of values and ethics that they're expecting of employees, then employees see that as real. If they walk the talk, they believe that this is something that is valued, that is expected of them. They understand what's expected of them, and they believe it. But that commitment has to start at the top with the boards.
And do you ever find sometimes there's a disconnect between sort of the board's values, missions, and ethics and what is actually going on in the front line?
A lot of the time, and sometimes that disconnect is sort of minor in some way, where it's sort of people just don't really believe the mission, and they're sort of lackluster about it, and they're not really following what's expected of them, and it just leads to there's not employee engagement, and maybe it's not the most effective and efficient organization it could be if you had a really engaged workforce. But the absolute worst example of that is when there's actually fraudulent behavior or corporate failures that governors and directors are just not aware of or not on top of.
So let's talk about RIM for a little bit, which is kind of a sad story in many ways, being such a great Canadian iconic company globally. Some major issues, has gone on with RIM at the governance level. Certainly corrective action is now taken, but let's talk about that whole situation where you have two co-CEOs and kind of self-appointed board of directors.
Well, I would say also, I don't think the RIM story is over yet. That's one thing I would say. But absolutely, RIM is an example in some way of not following some of the best practices that have been directed to corporations. In sort of the post-Enron, some of the sort of the major collapses of companies in the U.S., there was legislation that people may have heard of. It's called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. They sometimes call it SOX. But basically that was a set of rules that were put in place after those massive failures that tried to improve corporate governance. And one of the things that they talked about particularly was looking at independence, the independence of thinking, the independence of board chairs and the directors themselves. So one of the best practices was the idea that they should separate the function of the CEO of an organization and the board chair. And at RIM, they had not done that, that the co-CEOs were also chair of the board. The other best practice would be to appoint independent directors, and by that what they mean there are directors that are not officers of the company, don't have a vested interest, and the reason that they say this is a best practice is that when there is independence of thinking, when there's a variety, diversity at the board, there's not groupthink, and there's more of an opportunity to come up with a new strategy, the correct strategy, to sort of see the forest for the trees. And perhaps there was a call from major shareholders had said to RIM that you should be following some of these best practices in governance, and that there was a belief that perhaps had they might have come up with maybe a more appropriate strategy, so a different direction when RIM was facing some difficulties.
And of course, the importance of that from a job perspective is that instead of the company growing jobs, thousands of people have had lost their jobs. And so hence the importance of good governance.
That's when people understand, when the impact hits home, when there's job loss, when there's loss of shareholder value, which is very real. When stocks go down, people's pensions are attached to that. People's real money is attached to that. So the impact is not it's not just academic. It's very real, and it can hit home in small communities. It can hit home very quickly when there's a failure at that level.
Let's talk a little bit about ethics. Mm-hmm. We saw a huge issue develop out of the City of Toronto with its mayor, Rob Ford. Talk to us from your perspective about that.
Well, in my experience, people understand governance when you look at the political system. So that's, there's a corollary between the political system and how corporations are controlled. And, in some ways, to not talk about politics and not talk about politics, if you just look at the governing aspect of that, there's an example where the good governance is so important. So there were some good governance practices that were not followed, some conflict of interest guidelines that were in place that appeared to have been violated. Now, the consequence of that is for something that some people say was a minor infraction, the consequences are huge. So now you have a board of governors, which are the elected officials in Toronto, who are in some way distracted, disarray over this incident. Their leader, which is the mayor, is now sidelined, and the corporation, which the City of Toronto is a corporation, they have big business to do. They're running a city. They have big decisions to make. They don't need to be distracted and sidelined by something like this. So there's a really perfect example of how good governance can impact not just companies but corporations that run cities.
Now let's talk about Hamilton Health Sciences in our community, which you and I have discussed as probably a leader in really wonderful corporate governance, has been named one of the top 100 employers in Canada, is certainly the leader of employment, and has a wonderful vision. Let's talk about Hamilton Health Sciences.
Well, that's a good example to help people understand that services like hospitals and schools are also run by boards of directors and their governors, so governance is important there. It's a vital service. You don't want to have a corporation that doesn't have direction at the top when you're delivering a vital service like that. The two aspects that I would talk about, one is the fact that they have been recognized as one of the top 100 employers, that they are committed to employee engagement, providing a good workplace. That also is a value and a direction that gets set at the board. So that is definitely, again, tone from the top. The board is determining that this is the kind of organization we want to be. We're aspiring to be a top 100 employer. So that would come from a board, and that shows vision and commitment on the part of those directors. The other thing that I would note in Hamilton, the Hamilton Health Sciences has gone through a major restructuring of how they deliver services. As we all know, you can't go to McMaster Children's Hospital anymore. Even if you act like a baby, they won't serve you there. So that was a major change that they went through, and that appears to be, the board was on top of that. They determined that new strategy, they executed it well, and they were committed to following up to make sure that what they had done was serving the community well. Again, it's not, the board doesn't execute this, the board oversees the strategy, but I would say that's a good example of how a good synergy between strategic direction at the board level and top managers at the organization have implemented something in our community.
Well, that has to be a very conscious decision to have top-notch governance, isn't it? I mean, that's not something that just happens by accident.
No, it's a commitment. You have to actually think about it. You have to be committed to it. You also, it's a skill. It's not something just because you are committed and that you have, a commitment to the organization, loyalty, ethical approach. It's also a skill, and so it's important for people to actually learn about how to be good governors. Not everyone. Sometimes people get onto boards, are either appointed or they're elected, and then when they get there, they realize, oh, there's more to this than just getting here. And so you really have to have a commitment to governance excellence.
And let's talk a little bit about Dr. Chris Bart's school for directors.
Yes.
I know that you're a student of Dr.
I am
Chris
a
Bart,
student, yes.
Graduating soon. Let's talk about what you learned there.
Well, I can't say enough about that program. It's actually here in Hamilton, and it is the gold standard of governance training in Canada. So it's a very intensive program, but you learn so much. I have been on boards for many years, and I have taken training for many years, but this immerses you in governance, and you get exposed to some of the leaders, across Canada, some of the thought leaders, some actual CEOs that have, performed and turned around corporations, and there's a lot of collaboration among your students. So I would recommend it highly if you are on a board. That's a serious position, and you need to take it seriously, and training of that nature helps you fulfill your obligation.
And when we're talking about the governance and sort of senior management, which is kind of the last buck, if you
That's
like,
right.
it stops at the board level. This impacts not only the public sector and private sector, but also impacts nonprofit organizations.
Absolutely.
So let's get a perspective on that, if you don't mind, about the importance of that, even if you're a nonprofit board.
That's right. In many ways, that's the most difficult area in my experience of governing, because often when you're on a board of a not-for-profit organization, they tend to be smaller organizations. Oftentimes you are seen you feel that you're a volunteer. You don't really understand entirely the importance of the fact that you are the custodian of this organization, that you are in charge. And but at the same time, you are really put in a very a position of trust. So you are a custodian of oftentimes public dollars. It's either through government or donations. People are members of these organizations, and very often you're delivering services to a vulnerable population. So even though they're smaller organizations, you're not sitting on the board of BP or Bell, so they're not large organizations, but the impact of your leadership is very real and very important to communities and people that are relying on those services.
What can people take away from our discussion if you're a chair of a board and you're looking for new directors? I mean, not everybody can afford to go to the Directors College or have the time to do so, but what should the average board be trying to do?
Well, I think the number one task is to actually stop and say, you know what, it's a function. Governance is a function, just like any other function in the organization, and it deserves some time and attention. And while absolutely not everyone can go to Directors College, has the time, or maybe even the need, there's lots of resources out there for people to understand what their role is. So it's something that just you need to actually understand that this is a position of responsibility, and that you need to take that seriously, and that people are relying on you, and that if there's a failure, the impact can be pretty great. You know that expression, there's always time to fix something, but never time to prevent it? I think this would be a very apt lesson at a governance level, whether you're volunteering at a small board, not-for-profit organization, or a large corporate board. You just imagine, I think what they say is, imagine it on the top of the fold, on the front page of the Globe, and if your failure in leadership ends up with something there that you might want to take some steps to make sure that you've taken the time to hone your skills and be more knowledgeable about the responsibility that you've accepted.
Do you find sometimes that greed kind of interferes with governance? I'm thinking of Wall Street, the meltdown in 08, 09, and the serious impact that is still having.
Mm-hmm. Huge impact, and I think that's that's the ultimate example of the failure of governance having devastating consequences. They talk about it was the failure of Wall Street impacted Main Street, and it's not only where people. I mean, what we talk about a lot is this created the housing price collapse, and people lost all kinds of equity and value and net worth. But they also didn't talk about some of the investors that were invested in these corporations that now just don't exist. I think. you know, you can call it greed or you can call it, you know, lack of stewardship. I mean, what was going on at the board level that prevented this from happening? And that tone, whether it was, you know, it was the idea of, you know, infinite progress and more profit, that was set at the board level. And those failures, you know, will go on for quite a long time. I mean, all that private debt that was accumulated now has become public debt. So despite the fact that, you know, people in certain small communities across the U.S. might have had nothing to do with Wall Street, they're feeling the impact of that in their very lives. And so, you know, it again speaks to the confluence of ethical behavior, setting values, setting expectations, and having, as a board, the courage to stick to your convictions.
And do you think that that some of those convictions and all those good pieces, are they communicated properly? We touched a little bit on that when we started off the show in our discussion, but are they actually, do people actually walk the walk and talk the talk, or is it just something that gets said and put into a binder and nobody ever does it anymore?
Well, like anything, it's hard. You know, it's hard to walk the talk, and I think that there are cases where there's exemplar cases where organizations live their values, and from the board chair, the CEO, right down to the organization, they will, you know, broker no difference from what their expectations are. But it's not something that can happen without intention. You know, you have to really believe it. You have to mean it. You have to spend time to make sure that happens. You also have to incent that kind of behavior. You know, you can't say we want to be an organization where we're an ethical corporation with good values, whatever they may be determined, and then you have you don't reward or incent employees for acting on those. So it's not something that can happen lightly. It has to be intentional. You have to really make sure you drive that message and that change from the top right through the organization.
Do you think that we're heading into more good governance, or are we moving away from it, just generally?
Well, I don't know. I would like to think that we are paying attention to it, because more and more these corporate failures are coming to light, and people generally are you know, not happy with this. I think there's a general level of well, there's not just general, there's a huge mistrust of large corporations and their failures. So I would say that it's in the public eye more than it has been. I would say that there's regulations, there's training, there's attention being paid to it to try and get to a point where we have better governance. You know, I think that the commitment's there and the understanding is there. It's just you know, I think it's just making sure that you put your nose to the grindstone and make that happen. I think I hope to say yes, we're going to see better governance, and you know, I for one think that it's vital and important, and the more we talk about it, good governance examples and failures, the more that we are setting the standard for what we expect from the corporations and organizations that function in our community.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sandy, and
You're
all the
welcome.
best in the boardroom.
Thanks very much.
More on Hamilton Works right after this. Welcome back to Hamilton Works. I'm your host, Al Lutchin, and in this segment we're going to be talking to Fred Hopkinson, Executive Vice President for Career Compass Canada, about the importance of job search at this time of year, because some of us have a tendency maybe to maybe want to slack off a little bit if you're in career transition, and we've got some points and some pointers as to how to maybe find that dream job this time of year. Fred, welcome.
Good evening, Al.
So tell us a little bit about, Fred, the importance of not stopping the job search, putting our feet up on the ottoman and going in autopilot for 4 or 5 weeks.
Well, firstly, you know, it's hard to believe that we're here already, back into the Christmas season. But, you know, stopping job search at this point in time doesn't, for a lot of reasons, make a great deal of sense. And now this isn't something that only happens during holiday periods. You know, people will put their job search on hold for a variety of reasons, and that's not good, and, you know, we can talk about that. But despite the conventional wisdom, many job seekers will find the holiday time is actually a good time to be looking for a job. While some companies do put hiring on a hold for a period of time, a lot of other ones actually continue to try to fill positions in preparation for their new fiscal year, which in many cases is the same as the calendar year. So, you know, in this day and age with an unemployment rate around the 7% figure, there's lots of competition out there. And so what the job seeker wants to do is take advantage of every opportunity he or she has to try and get a leg up, in a sense, over the opposition. And continuing a job search, you know, during the holiday season makes a lot of sense for that reason. There was a recent study done of human resources managers, a survey, and approximately 30% of them indicated that they still have positions that they want to fill by the end of this year, which isn't that far away. And there are a lot of good reasons for for not putting the job search on hold.
And let's talk about the importance, Fred, of networking, because there's lots of great networking opportunities this time of year, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, as you well know, Al, networking is where most people get jobs. Better than 60% of people surveyed who got employment got it through the networking process. So networking is something that should be very high on on your list at any particular time. But networking during the holiday season can be, in some ways, a lot easier than it is at other times of the year. You have an opportunity for, attending Christmas parties, family get-togethers, and so on, which all bring people together that you may want to networking. And so if you put your job search on hold, that really reduces your momentum, and it's sometimes hard to regain that afterwards. The holiday season is an opportunity for you to, for instance, send Christmas cards and to make connections that way. And when you do that, you want to make certain that you let the individual that you're sending a card to know that you will be in touch with them later on. And that kind of paves the way for a phone call, and in the new year, in this case, that's going to be probably received a lot more graciously and courteously than it might otherwise be if they're not expecting you to call. And I think it's just an opportunity for you to try and take advantage of an employment situation.
And certainly networking online is important too, Fred, like dealing with LinkedIn and Luda and Indeed and all those important high-profile sites.
Absolutely. I mean, more people are going to be spending time on the social networks. So it's an ideal opportunity to increase your networking activities there. It's also an opportunity for you to have another look at the social media. Have a look at your LinkedIn profile, for instance. It's, maybe it needs updating. There are changes taking place on an ongoing basis with the social networks. And so this is a good opportunity when you've got a little bit of slack time to be able to take the time to get in there and have a look at them, brush up your profile, see what changes they've made, try to accommodate to those changes.
Now, Fred, relative to sort of starting the job search again in January after you've done all your good networking and so on, what's a good starting point? Because sometimes the first couple of weeks is kind of everybody getting back into the groove of things. What do you recommend in terms of touch points if you don't hear back from somebody? What should you do?
Oh, well, I think firstly you want to get started as quickly as possible after the year, after the beginning of the new year. Again, for the reason I mentioned before, a lot of people won't do that. They'll be sitting back, taking an extra week of vacation, enjoying themselves. And it's an opportunity for you to, again, hopefully get a leg up on the competition. These days, it's very, very difficult to make contact with people, as you well know. The voicemail is a roadblock that frustrates the life out of most people. But if you find if you're networking or you're making those calls during the holiday period, many times, the gatekeepers, so-called, are not there. They may be off shopping or taking a few extra days here and there. So you're more likely to connect with the person that you really want to talk to, because he or she may well be answering their own phone in the absence of the secretary. I think it's important that you don't give up too early. If you don't get a response, give it a few days and have another go. Okay? They say the best time to connect with people is between 9 and 10 in the morning, or between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't make calls other than those times, but those are the times when the professionals, and particularly the sales professionals, will tell you is the most likely times that you're going to connect with the person that you want to talk with.
Let's talk about the importance of the resume, Fred. I know that there's so many different sort of channels out there to search for a job today, and the LinkedIn profiles and so on. But at the end of the day, that resume is still that kind of golden bridge between the applicant and getting the interview. Is that the way you see it?
Well, that's the purpose of the resume. The purpose of the resume is not to get your job. What gets you the job is the interview. So the purpose of the resume is to get you the interview. And so the resume is of critical importance in the job search. And it's, as, we've discussed before, there are different formats of resumes. People want to, decide whether they're interested in a chronological, which most people tend to use, or a functional, if they're going to try and change jobs or want to change career paths, or something in a hybrid that best suits their situation. So the resume is very, very important.
And Fred, we should talk just briefly about Indeed and Alluda. Those are both excellent job search engines as well, right, that people should pay attention
Indeed, to? Indeed, Alluda, Simply Hired is another very good one. And yes, they're all excellent job search engines, and people should be checking in on them on a regular basis.
Regular basis as in like every day, every couple of days?
Every couple of days. You can set up job alerts that will advise you within 24 to 48 hours of jobs that have been advertised. So if you go on every second or third day, you're going to be, in addition to the job alerts that you're getting, you're going to be able to keep up with everything that's out there.
Yeah. Do you find today that with the level of competition that sometimes really frustrates the job searcher out there? And what's your sort of key advice in 30 seconds on how to get over that obstacle?
How to get over the competition?
Yeah. Can you tell us that?
It's extremely difficult, but you need a plan. You need a plan from the outset. You want to make certain that you have an up-to-date and professional resume. That's really key to it. You want to make certain that you're touching all the bases with the social media. Make certain that you're actively networking. Again, that's where you're more likely to get success than other areas. A lot of people tend to overlook recruiters and employment agencies. There are still 10 to 15% of people who get jobs through those venues. So recruiters are not something you should overlook. But having said that, you want to make certain that you don't restrict yourself to one or two. It's another failing that people tend to have. They'll select one or two agencies and have them, in effect, go to work for them. There's no point in restricting yourself. These agencies and recruiters tend to have their own clients, so that you could be working with 10 or 12 without any difficulty at all.
Fred, thanks very much.
You're very welcome.
You've been watching Hamilton Works on Cable 14. Thank you for watching.